I never thought I'd have a problem living in an HOA community. Honestly, when my wife and I first moved here, we liked the idea of a well-kept neighborhood. The streets were always clean, the lawns were trimmed, and everything looked perfect. Too perfect, maybe, but we figured it was worth it. After all, how bad could it be? Well, let me introduce you to Karen. Karen wasn't just any HOA board member. She was the president, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. She took her job way too seriously, like dictator-level serious. And she was everywhere. You'd be watering your plants, and boom, there she was, arms crossed, reminding you that your flower pots weren't within the HOA guidelines. Put your trash cans out an hour early? Expect a warning letter in the mail. At first, my wife Emily and I tried to stay on her good side. We waved when we saw her, followed the rules, well, most of them, and kept our heads down. But then little things started to add up. One time, our son left his skateboard on the driveway overnight. The next morning, we woke up to an email from the HOA. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, please be advised that personal items must not be left outside overnight as they disrupt the uniform appearance of our community. Uniform appearance? It was a skateboard. On our own driveway. Then there was the time Emily planted some flowers in our front yard, simple, colorful petunias. They made the house feel warm and inviting. But Karen? Oh no, she was furious. Apparently, they didn't match the pre-approved landscaping colors for the neighborhood. David, she told me one afternoon, standing on our porch uninvited, I'm sure you didn't realize that bright pink flowers aren't allowed. The HOA has a strict color palette for front yards. You'll need to remove them. I just stared at her. Was this woman serious? At first, I thought she was joking. But she stood there, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, waiting for me to agree. So, of course, I said, I'll take care of it. And by take care of it, I meant ignoring her completely. The flowers stayed. That's when the real trouble started. After that, it felt like Karen had a personal vendetta against us. We started getting notices for ridiculous things. Our car was parked 1 inch over the designated parking line, our porch light was too bright, even our mailbox was slightly tilted. And every time, she made sure to remind us that we were breaking HOA rules. I knew we were on her bad side, but I never thought it would get worse. Then, one night, everything changed. It was a regular evening. Emily and I had just finished dinner when I felt a sharp, crushing pain in my chest. At first, I thought it was just indigestion. But within minutes, the pain spread to my arm. My breathing became shallow. My vision blurred. I knew something was really wrong. Emily saw my face and panicked. David? What's wrong? Talk to me. I could barely get the words out. Call an ambulance. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking. Please, we need help, she told the operator. My husband, he's having chest pain, he can't breathe. The dispatcher assured her an ambulance was on the way. But what we didn't know, what we couldn't have expected, was that our biggest obstacle that night wouldn't be the heart attack. It would be Karen. The ambulance tore through the quiet streets, its sirens wailing in the night. I was barely conscious, my chest tight, my breath shallow. Emily was by my side, gripping my hand so tightly that I could feel her nails pressing into my skin. Just hold on, David. They're coming. Just hold on. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that I was going to be okay. But every word felt like a mountain I couldn't climb. Everything was blurry, and the pain, God, the pain, felt like someone was squeezing the life out of me inch by inch. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the ambulance getting closer. Relief washed over me. Just a little longer. I could make it, or so I thought. What happened next was something no one would ever believe unless they lived in an HOA neighborhood run by someone like Karen. The ambulance pulled up to the front gates of our pristine, regulation-approved neighborhood. But instead of rolling through to reach me, it came to a sudden halt. The siren shut off. Something was wrong. Emily let go of my hand and ran to the window, confusion and panic all over her face. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911 again. They're here, but they're not moving. Why aren't they moving? Meanwhile, at the entrance to our neighborhood, a different kind of chaos was unfolding. Karen, in her silk robe and slippers, stood firmly in front of the gate, arms crossed like a bouncer at an exclusive nightclub. I'm sorry, but emergency vehicles are not permitted inside the community without proper authorization. The paramedics were stunned. One of them, a young woman named Rachel, stepped forward, trying to reason with her. Ma'am, this is a medical emergency. We received a 911 call. I don't care who called you, Karen snapped. There are rules in this neighborhood. You need an official visitor's pass. Do you have one? The other paramedic, an older man named Greg, exchanged an exasperated glance with his partner. Ma'am, with all due respect, we don't need a visitor's pass. This is an emergency. A man is having a heart attack. We need to get to him now. Karen shook her head, completely unmoved. If I let one emergency vehicle in without following proper procedure, then everyone will think they can break the rules. What's next? Delivery trucks coming in at all hours? People parking where they please? I won't allow it. Rachel clenched her jaw, trying to keep her composure. Ma'am, we are wasting valuable time arguing with you. If we don't reach the patient right now, he could die. Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. Don't be so dramatic. If it's really an emergency, his family can drive him out to meet you. That's what we have the designated pickup zone for. Greg, already exhausted from the long shift, had had enough. He reached for the gate's keypad to manually override it. That's when Karen physically stepped in front of him, arms outstretched like some kind of deranged traffic cop. I will call security on you. Rachel exhaled sharply, then turned away and pressed her radio. Dispatch, we have an obstruction preventing us from reaching the patient. We need law enforcement at our location immediately. Emily paced back and forth, her panic mounting with each passing second. My condition was worsening, I could feel it. My chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible weight. My vision was tunneling. Where are they? Emily screamed, dialing the paramedics again. Ma'am. Rachel's voice came through the speaker, tense but calm. We're at the front gate, but an HOA representative is refusing to let us in. We've contacted law enforcement, but we need someone to come and open the gate manually. Emily's face twisted in disbelief. Karen. It has to be Karen. That bitch. She grabbed the keys and ran for the door. Stay with me? I croaked out, barely managing the words. She froze at the doorway, torn between getting the paramedics in and staying by my side. I knew she didn't want to leave me, but she had no choice. If she didn't open that damn gate, I might not survive. I'll be right back, she promised, dashing out of the house and into the cold night air. When Emily got to the front entrance, she saw red. Karen stood there, still blocking the paramedics, looking completely unbothered by the fact that someone was dying just a few blocks away. Move! Now! Emily shouted, running up to the gate controls. Karen turned to her with an infuriatingly smug expression. Oh, Emily, you should know better than anyone. We can't just let anyone waltz in whenever they feel like it. There are rules. Emily's hands were shaking, but not from fear, from rage. You are literally stopping an ambulance from saving my husband's life. If you don't move, I swear to God. Don't you dare threaten me, Karen hissed. You think you can just bypass regulations because you feel like it? The world doesn't work that way, sweetheart. He is dying. Emily was practically screaming now. Karen crossed her arms. I highly doubt that. Emily didn't have time for this. She shoved past Karen, reaching for the keypad to manually open the gate. But Karen grabbed her wrist, yanking her back. That's private property. You can't just... Emily punched her. It wasn't a slap. It wasn't a shove. It was a full-force punch to Karen's face that sent her stumbling backward. The paramedics didn't even flinch. Greg just muttered under his breath. About damn time. Emily wasted no time. She punched in the override code, and the gates finally swung open. The ambulance roared past, sirens blaring, heading straight for me. Karen stood there, holding her cheek, absolutely stunned. You just assaulted me. I'll have you arrested. Emily shot her a glare so sharp it could have cut glass. Go ahead. Call the cops. They're already on their way. But when they get here, they'll be far more interested in the woman who obstructed an emergency response than the one who punched her for it. For the first time in her life, Karen had nothing to say. Emily didn't stick around to see if she'd recover from the shock. She sprinted back to the house as the paramedics rushed inside. I barely remember what happened after that. Everything was a haze. I remember the paramedics talking to me, checking my vitals, loading me onto the stretcher. I remember Emily's hand gripping mine, whispering, "You're going to be okay." I wanted to believe her, but we had wasted so much time. Everything felt like a blur. The paramedics rushed into the house, their voices overlapping as they assessed me, but I could barely process any of it. The pain in my chest had reached an unbearable level, and a cold sweat drenched my body. I could hear Emily's voice somewhere in the background, frantic and desperate, but I couldn't make out the words. Meanwhile, outside, the scene was escalating. Mr. Carter, our next-door neighbor, had witnessed the entire ordeal from his front porch. A retired police officer with decades of experience, he had seen his fair share of absurd situations, but this was something else entirely. As soon as he saw Karen physically blocking the paramedics, he pulled out his phone and dialed the police. Unlike Emily, who was in a state of panic, Carter's voice was calm, authoritative, and to the point. "This is Officer Carter, retired from the City Police Department. I'm reporting an active obstruction of emergency medical services at the Oak Ridge HOA entrance. The suspect is a woman named Karen Dawson, who is refusing to let an ambulance through. The patient is reportedly in critical condition. Immediate response is required." The dispatcher didn't waste time. "Understood, Officer Carter. We have units en route." Carter hung up and stormed across the street toward the gate. "Karen," he called out, his voice sharp. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen turned to him, clearly irritated. "I'm doing my job, Carter. Rules are rules. I won't have random vehicles barging into this neighborhood. You're obstructing emergency personnel. You moron. That's a felony. You could go to jail for this." Karen scoffed, crossing her arms. "Oh, please. No one's getting arrested over a neighborhood rule." "You sure about that?" Carter gestured down the street. Blue and red lights flashed in the distance. The police had arrived. 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car, their expressions serious. The lead officer, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached the scene. "We received a report that emergency responders were being obstructed. What's going on here?" Rachel, the paramedic, immediately jumped in. "Officer, this woman," she pointed at Karen, "refused to let us enter the neighborhood. We have a patient in critical condition, and we've already lost valuable time." Karen huffed, rolling her eyes. "I was simply enforcing HOA regulations. Emergency vehicles still have to follow protocol. If I let them in without a visitor's pass, it sets a bad precedent." The officer's face hardened. "Ma'am, step aside. Right now." "Excuse me." Karen blinked in disbelief. "You don't understand, No, you don't understand." The officer's tone dropped to a deadly calm. "It is illegal to obstruct emergency services. You are actively delaying medical attention to someone who may be dying. If you do not move this second, I will place you under arrest for obstruction of justice." For the first time, Karen hesitated. She glanced around as if expecting someone to back her up. But Carter just shook his head in disappointment, and Emily, who had come running back from the house, looked like she was ready to commit a crime of her own. Karen lifted her chin. "I was just following protocol." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Karen's face drained of color. "Wait, what?" The officer wasn't playing. He reached for his handcuffs. "No, wait. Fine. I'll move." Karen stammered, finally stepping away from the gate. "See? I'm cooperating." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then turned to the paramedics. "Go. Get to the patient." Rachel and Greg didn't waste another second. They jumped back into the ambulance, and the sirens blared as they sped into the neighborhood. Karen, however, wasn't off the hook. "Ma'am, you're still being detained," the officer said. "We're going to need to take a statement." "This is outrageous." Karen fumed. "I was just enforcing the rules. You can't treat me like some criminal." Carter shook his head. "You are a criminal, Karen. And if David dies because of this, I'll make sure you really pay for it." Back at the house, I was barely hanging on. Everything felt distant, my vision swimming as Emily gripped my hand. "They're almost here, David. Just hold on. Please." Then finally, the front door burst open. "We've got you," Rachel said as she and Greg rushed to my side, their equipment in hand. "Stay with us, David. We're going to get you to the hospital." The last thing I remember before blacking out was the feeling of Emily kissing my forehead and whispering, "I love you." Then darkness. As the ambulance sped away, the police continued dealing with Karen. She was still ranting about how unfair this was, how she was just doing her job. But Carter wasn't having it. "You know what your job actually is, Karen? Making sure the neighborhood runs smoothly. Not playing God with people's lives." Karen scoffed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. He's probably fine." Carter clenched his jaw. "If he isn't, that's on you." For the first time, Karen looked uncertain. The officer turned to her. "You're coming with us. Whether or not charges are pressed, you need to come down to the station for questioning." Karen's mouth opened in protest, but no words came out. For once, she had nothing to say. Hours later, I woke up to bright hospital lights. My chest felt lighter, though there was an ache beneath my ribs. Machines beeped softly around me. Emily was there, her eyes red from crying, but when she saw me open my eyes, she let out a relieved sob. "You're okay," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "You're okay." I managed a weak smile. I guess Karen didn't kill me after all. Emily laughed, but it was shaky. Not for lack of trying. Carter had been right. If things had gone differently, I might not have survived. Karen had cost us 10 whole minutes. Minutes that, in a situation like this, could mean the difference between life and death. But as I lay there, recovering, I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Karen had finally crossed the line, and now? She was going to face the consequences. For real this time. Waking up in the hospital felt surreal. The sterile smell of disinfectant, the steady beeping of the heart monitor, the soft murmur of nurses in the hallway, it all blurred together. But the one thing I could focus on, the one thing that kept me anchored to reality, was Emily's hand in mine. "Hey," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're really awake this time." I managed a weak smile. "Yeah, guess I made it." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she laughed through them. "You scared the hell out of me, David." I squeezed her hand as tightly as I could manage. "Sorry about that." She exhaled shakily, then kissed my forehead. "You're never allowed to do that again." I didn't argue. After everything that had happened, I was just grateful to be alive. While I was recovering, news of what Karen had done spread like wildfire. At first, it was just the immediate neighbors talking. But then Carter, our retired cop neighbor, made sure the whole damn town knew. He told the HOA board. He told the local news. He even gave an interview to a community watchdog blog that loved exposing HOA horror stories. Within 24 hours, everyone in the neighborhood knew that Karen had deliberately blocked an ambulance during a life-or-death emergency. And let's just say people were not happy. The next day, the HOA board called for an emergency meeting. And this time, it wasn't just the usual crowd of rule-following retirees and lawn-manic obsessives. No, this time half the damn neighborhood showed up. Emily went in my place, but I didn't need to be there to know how it went down. Karen strutted into that meeting like she still had control, like she still held all the power in the room. She even tried to justify her actions. I was simply following protocol. If we make exceptions, then what's the point of having rules at all, she argued, standing at the front of the community center like she wasn't the most hated person in the room. Someone from the back shouted, "The rules don't matter when someone's dying, Karen." And that was the moment the room erupted. People yelled over each other, calling her out for being heartless, for being a control freak, for caring more about her power trip than the lives of the people who actually lived in the neighborhood. Emily, standing near the front, was shaking with rage. "My husband almost died because of you. And you have the nerve to stand here and defend yourself?" Karen scoffed. "Oh, please. He was fine. If it were a real emergency, you could have driven him yourself." That was the moment Carter stood up and said, "Karen, sit down and shut the hell up." The room fell silent. Karen's face turned red with fury. "Excuse me." Carter crossed his arms. "You heard me. You're done. This community has put up with your power-hungry nonsense for years. But this is beyond unacceptable." Another board member stood up. "We're calling for an immediate vote to remove Karen Dawson from her position as HOA president. Effective immediately." Karen gasped like she had just been personally attacked. "You can't do that." The board member raised an eyebrow. "Watch us." They passed out ballots, and within 10 minutes, the votes were counted. 87-3. Karen was officially removed. She stood there, stunned, as if she couldn't comprehend what just happened. "You people are making a mistake. You need someone like me to keep order. We need someone with a heart." Karen, a woman near the front, snapped. "Not a damn dictator." And with that, Karen, still fuming, was escorted out of the meeting by security. But her problems weren't over. Not even close. See, the police weren't done with her. Turns out, obstructing emergency medical services? That's a serious crime. The paramedics, along with multiple neighbors including Carter, filed official complaints against her. And while she wasn't arrested that night, an investigation was launched into her misconduct. A few weeks later, she was formally charged with obstruction of emergency personnel. She tried to fight it. She tried to argue her way out of it. But there were too many witnesses, too many complaints, and too much public outrage. She ended up with a hefty fine, court-mandated community service, and was banned from ever holding an HOA position again. To say she was humiliated would be an understatement. Weeks passed and life slowly returned to normal. My health improved, and Emily and I found ourselves at the center of an unexpected wave of support from the neighborhood. People checked in on us, offered to help with chores, even dropped off home-cooked meals. It was strange, in a way. Before this, we had always felt like we were just living in this neighborhood. But now we were part of a community. One evening, as I sat on the porch recovering, Carter came over with 2 beers. "Figured you could use a drink," he said, handing me one. I chuckled. "Doctor says I should hold off for a bit." He nodded, then set the second beer down beside me anyway. "For when you're ready." We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. Finally, I sighed. "You ever seen anything like that before?" Carter let out a low whistle. "Oh, I've seen some crazy stuff." "But Karen? She took the cake." I shook my head. "All of that, over some stupid HOA rules." Carter took a sip of his beer. "People like Karen? They don't care about rules. They care about control. Doesn't matter who gets hurt in the process." I exhaled, staring at the sky. "Well, at least it's over." Carter smirked. "Yeah, and now we get to watch her do community service cleaning up trash on the side of the highway." I laughed, and for the first time in weeks, it felt good. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought rules mattered more than human lives. She thought she could get away with playing God. But in the end, she lost everything. And the rest of us? We learned something important that day. Power isn't about control, it's about responsibility. And when you forget that, when you put rules above people, you don't deserve to have power at all.